Hi and welcome to your next video for your Summer Independent Learning 2022, and this is the second video as part of your SIL. So you should have watched the biological approach, which was the first video for A2. So just before we start, if you'd like to get your booklet out, which is the yellow booklet that says Unit 3, Booklet 1, Learning Aim A, and we are on page 18 for this video. So if you'd like to get everything ready, and then we'll be ready to start. Okay, so just going to have a quick look at the specification. So the last video you did, you looked at biological influences, genetic predisposition and the role of neurotransmitters. And this lesson we're going to have a look at the behaviourist approaches. So you've got the role of cues, positive and negative reinforcement, and how we can use that to explain healthy and unhealthy behaviours using operant conditioning to encourage and incentivise behaviour. Okay, so we're just going to cover that in this lesson, and then we will you're going to look at social learning approach and the cognitive approach in a separate lesson. Okay, so we're just going to do a little bit of a recap. So first of all, what can you remember about the behaviourist approach from Unit 1? So if you'd like to get a little bit of paper and do a mind map on the behaviourist approach and what you can remember about how it explains behaviour. Okay, so if you want to pause the video and then press play when you're ready to go through it. Okay, so the two main key aspects to do with the behaviourist approach. So if you just have a look at number 4, just ignore number 5 for now. So the first one is that behaviour is learnt from environmental stimuli. So basically saying that we learn from our environment. So you might remember from Unit 1 that obviously the behaviourist approach would say that we're born as a blank slate, and then everything that we learn is from our environment through classical and operant conditioning. So we are going to cover some of those key concepts today, looking back over classical and operant conditioning, and then we're going to apply them to health. The bottom bit, number 5, that's to do with social learning theory, which is a separate approach within the learning approach. So within the learning approach, you've got the behaviourist approach, and then you've got social learning theory. We're not going to do much on social learning theory today because that's for the next video. So you've got classical and operant conditioning, which is the behaviourist approach, and then obviously social learning theory is separate. Social learning theory, remember, is learning through observation and imitation of role models. But as I've already mentioned, we're only going to focus on classical and operant conditioning, and your next video will look at social learning theory. Okay, so obviously behaviourist approach we're going to cover today, social learning theory we will look at next lesson. So we're just going to do a very quick recap of operant conditioning. You don't need to write any of this in your booklet, so if you just listen, and then I'll tell you when you need to write some information into your booklet. So you might recognise the psychologist on the screen, so that's Skinner, and he was the main psychologist who came up with the idea of operant conditioning, and it's learning through consequences. Okay? In simpler forms, thinking about learning through rewards and sometimes punishments, but the main thing you need to remember for this is learning through consequences. So with operant conditioning, if our behaviour is rewarded, then we are more likely to do it again. Okay, so you might remember as a child in primary school, you were given a lot of stickers, golden time, lots of rewards, and that made you learn very quickly that if you do good behaviour or you try really hard at school, then you would be rewarded for that. If you got a detention for not doing your homework or something like that, then that is a punishment, and therefore you would be less likely to do that behaviour again because you would receive a negative consequence for your behaviour. So obviously the example of the sticker, that is a positive consequence that makes it more likely that you will repeat that behaviour. But if you receive a negative consequence such as a punishment, you are less likely to repeat that behaviour. So applying this to health and well-being, if you look on page 18 now, you've got some information about the role of cues. Okay, so cues, in terms of, before we move on to cues more specifically, you need to have a bit of an understanding of primary and secondary reinforcement. Okay, so if you want to write this into your booklet, just leave a bit of space for your example. So primary reinforcement is where the reward fulfills a basic need. And then an example there, food fulfills hunger. So when you eat, that fulfills the basic need of obviously needing to eat food. So do you want to write that into your booklet on page 18? Okay, and then you've got secondary reinforcement. They're just in the other way around in your booklet. So the reward is associated with a basic need. So for example, you may get money and then you can use that to then buy food. So again, if you just want to make sure you've copied that up into the top of 18, page 18, you've got those two boxes at the top there. Okay, so if you want to just have a read of the text box at the top of 18, that gives you a little bit more information about cues and how they basically can lead to you repeating a behaviour. We'll come on to that in a minute. So before we move on to looking at cues more specifically, I want you to have a look at these images and decide whether it's a primary or secondary reinforcer. So you've got sleep, you've got a sticker, water, and then clothes. So just pause the video, and if you want to make some notes whether you think it's a primary or secondary reinforcer, and then press play when you're ready to go back through it. Okay, so if we have a look at the first one, sleep would obviously be a primary reinforcer because it's a basic need. So you need to obviously go to sleep. That's a basic need that we have as a human. We wouldn't be able to function without it. Getting a sticker would be a secondary reinforcer because it doesn't necessarily satisfy a basic need. Water would be a primary reinforcer because that satisfies a basic need, and then clothes would also be a secondary reinforcer. Okay, so this is basically the information from the top text box on page 18, and it's just giving you a little bit more information about the role of cues. So a cue is an object, people or place that accompany a behaviour or substance. So this is talking about addiction. So obviously people can get addicted to nicotine, for example, in a cigarette, but there are other cues that may trigger somebody to want to smoke. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So these act as a secondary reinforcer because they become associated through classical conditioning with the primary reinforcer. Okay, so if you think about smoking, that would be the primary reinforcer because that's satisfying the need of needing to smoke, the addiction to the nicotine, whereas a secondary reinforcer could be something like a lighter. You might still get a little bit of a buzz when you see that lighter because you associate that with smoking. So this sentence is really important here. So this means these objects, people and places become reinforcing in their own right because individuals experience some of the pleasurable response they get from the behaviour. Okay, so we'll have a look at some examples and make a little bit more sense for you now. So on page 18, you've got the same picture which you can see on the screen. And I want you to think of, before we go through it, some examples of cues that could also be associated with smoking. Okay, so for example, a lighter or something that might give someone that little bit of a buzz because they've associated that with smoking. So if you want to just make a little list, I am going to go through quite a few examples with you. So it's up to you whether you want to write them in your book or if you want to write them on a separate piece of paper, and then we can go through them together in a minute. So if you want to pause the video, write down some cues, and then press play when you're ready to go through it. Okay, so let's have a look at some cues that you could talk about. So some environments, maybe things like pubs or smoking areas, places where people usually smoke. So for example, if you go into a pub or you walk past the smoking area, that could give you a bit of a cue. It could give you a little bit of a buzz because you associate that with smoking. People, so friends and family members. Behaviours, some people smoke in the car, so just getting into the car might trigger them to want to smoke. Finishing a meal, leaving work, having a cup of tea. The smell of smoke or tobacco. Seeing a cigarette packet, a lighter, or maybe a logo. So that doesn't really happen anymore now, and that's one of the reasons why the government has banned sort of cigarette packets looking colourful and having pictures on. And you might have noticed that when you go into a shop, the packets of cigarettes are all covered up now. One of the reasons could have been that it's acting as a cue and making people want to smoke more. And then finally, if you're in a certain mood, if you're feeling particularly stressed or anxious, that can make people want to smoke again. So if you just want to write a couple of those in, you don't necessarily have to write them all in, and then press play when you're ready to move on to the next bit. Okay. So we're just going to do a little bit more work on classical conditioning before we go through the activity on the bottom of page 18. So again, if you want to do a little bit of a mind map, do some retrieval. What can you remember about classical conditioning? And can you remember how it works? So can you remember the process of classical conditioning? Okay, so if you want to pause the video and press play when you're ready to go through it. Okay, so let's have a look. You may have mentioned some of the terminology. If you haven't, then feel free to pause the video again and maybe have a think about what some of this terminology means and how you could maybe apply it to addiction or smoking. Okay, so we've got some key terminology here. So we've got the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So we're going to have a look at those in a little bit more detail and give you a bit of a recap. So classical conditioning, instead of, obviously we talked about operant conditioning as a bit of a recap earlier, classical conditioning is the following. So direct learning through association of events within the environment. Okay, so people learn to associate a stimulus in the environment, so that's just anything really, with an automatic reflex response to create new behaviour patterns. So I'm sure you will have looked at Pavlov's dogs. In terms of that experiment, the automatic reflex response was salivation, and the stimulus that they taught the dog to salivate to was the sound of a bell, wasn't it? So that's a really classic example of classical conditioning, which I'm sure you've already covered, but I'm going to give you another one just to give you a little bit more of an example. So just to kind of give you a little bit more information, you don't need to write any of this down in your booklet. This is just a little bit of a recap over what classical conditioning is. If you want to write notes in your booklet, feel free to do that, and if you want a little bit more time to write it down, again, just press pause on the video if you want to pause at a particular point. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more information about the different types of stimuli. So you've got the neutral stimulus. So this is something in the environment where the humans or animals even have no natural reflex response. So this is something that doesn't usually affect behaviour, or it doesn't cause any reflex response. Okay, so I'm going to use this example of somebody becoming scared or having a phobia to a feather. So this isn't anything that you need to write in your booklet again, this is just I'm going to go through it just to give you a bit of a recap over classical conditioning. So in this example, seeing a feather, which would be classed as a neutral stimulus, wouldn't change somebody's behaviour. So it doesn't change behaviour at all. If I present you with a feather now, it doesn't produce any response in you. Then we've got the unconditioned stimulus, and this is an environmental stimulus that naturally causes a reflex response in humans. So if I make a really loud noise, you would naturally jump and have a startle response. Okay? So all of this will make sense as we're going through the examples. You've then got an unconditioned response. So this is an automatic and unlearned reflex response to an unconditioned stimulus. So if we think about the unconditioned stimulus, which was the loud noise, you're naturally going to produce a response of being scared. Okay? So the startle reflex is that feared response to a loud noise. Okay? So if you just go back to number 2, you've got the loud noise, and that's going to make people scared. And then the unconditioned response is the fear. Okay, when I present somebody with a loud noise. You've then got the conditioned stimulus. So those first 3 types of stimuli are before classical conditioning occurs. And then after classical conditioning occurs, you now have the conditioned stimulus. So let's just have a read of this. So if a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, then they now become associated with the neutral stimulus until the neutral stimulus automatically causes the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. So some of this won't really make that much sense. I'll talk you through it in a minute. And that becomes a conditioned stimulus. So if we apply it to the example, you've got someone who's presented with a feather, which is a neutral stimulus, at the same time as a loud bang, which would be the unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, the feather, which has now become the conditioned stimulus, because after that's happened, new learning has occurred, and now the feather causes the fear. So even without the loud bang, if you present someone with the feather, they're going to maybe jump or have a startle reflex because they have associated the feather with fear now. Okay? And then finally, you've got the conditioned response. So this is when a person shows the same response to the neutral stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus being present. So they have now learnt the response. And that's now called the conditioned response. So every time someone sees a feather, they might flinch and show fear. So they have now become conditioned. So I'll show you a diagram in a minute which might make a little bit more sense to you. Okay, so let's have a look at all of that put together in a bit more of a visual diagram. So before conditioning, you've got the neutral stimulus, which is the feather, and that produces no response. So as I said before, if I present you with a feather, it's not going to produce any response at all. The unconditioned stimulus, because it hasn't been learnt yet, is now the loud noise, and that produces an unconditioned response of fear or showing a startle response. So if someone jumps out at you, you jump. During conditioning, you put the feather with the loud noise, and that produces fear. So you do that maybe once or twice, a couple of times, and then afterwards, the feather on its own, without the loud bang, now becomes the conditioned response. So if you have a look there, you can see the feather on its own produces the conditioned response of fear. Okay, so feel free to pause the video, just try and get your head around that a little bit more, and then press play when you're ready to look at how we could apply that to smoking. So having to think about then, how could we actually apply this to smoking? So in your booklet on page 18, you've got a diagram. Okay, so you've got the unconditioned stimulus, which is UCS, the unconditioned response, UCR, neutral stimulus, which is NS, conditioned stimulus, CS, and then conditioned response, which is CR. So have a think about, before we go through it, what you think those would be in terms of smoking, okay? So, thinking about those cues that we looked at earlier, so we've got things like a lighter, your friends and family, the smell of smoke, going into a pub, all of those things could trigger you wanting to smoke, okay? And these have become associated with smoking. So even if you're not smoking, if you see a lighter or a cigarette, or you can smell it, that makes you want to continue to smoke, or it makes you want to pick up a cigarette and smoke again. So if you want to fill in the diagram at the bottom of page 18, the unconditioned response would be pleasure, which is created by dopamine, and the unconditioned stimulus would be nicotine. So naturally, the nicotine produces a response of pleasure. The neutral stimulus is a cue, so you can choose any you like. I've just put a lighter there. So you would pair the neutral stimulus, which is the lighter, okay, with nicotine, and then obviously that produces pleasure. So you put them together during conditioning. And then over time, your lighter now produces a natural response of pleasure, or gives you a craving to continue to smoke. So if you want to write that into the bottom of page 18, and then press play on the video when you're ready to go through the next page. Okay, so if you want to turn over to page 19, we're just going to have a look at another example. So that example was applied to smoking. The next example is going to be applied to food. So I want you to just have a think about, I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen, and I just want you to think about, what do the following pictures make you think of? So you can write it down if you want, or you could just think about it in your head. So here's picture 1. So really think about, is it bringing any senses up? Can you smell anything? Is it making you want to do anything? Just have a little think. Okay, next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. And I think this is the last one. Okay, so thinking about some of those things that I just showed you, you might have thought about different things as the different logos or images were propping up, and that's what a cue is. So you might have thought about, when you see McDonald's, you can think about the chips or the burgers or all the nice food that you want to eat. So you've got some reading to do. If you want, what I suggest you do is scan the QR code on page 19, have a quick read of it on your phone, and then we'll go through some of the answers together. Okay, so if you want to just have a read of that, and then write down your thoughts or ideas, and then we'll go through it together in a minute. So if you just want to press pause and then press play when you're ready to go through it. So the first question is, how can fast foods cause us to crave food? So if you want to write this in, so when we see certain images, they spark a desire to eat certain food or beverages, and we actually have these cues everywhere. So they remind us of the enjoyable experience of eating or consuming the product, and cues could be visual, mental, auditory, so through sounds, or even olfactory, which is through the smell. So you might walk past McDonald's, be able to smell the chips, and then makes you want to go into McDonald's and buy that food. So you want to write that down onto page 19 and then press play when you're ready to go through the next section. Okay, the next one. So we don't need to necessarily write this down, but just to kind of give you a bit more information on how it would work in terms of classical conditioning. So before, the food smell would be the unconditioned stimulus and feeling hungry would be the unconditioned response. You then put the smell with the logo and that makes you feel hungry. And then the logo makes you feel hungry. Okay, you don't necessarily need to write that down, but just kind of a bit of a recap. So fast food logos, how could they affect children? So that's question number 2. So children recognise fast food logos quicker than other food logos, which is quite scary. So researchers found that if you show children pictures of logos, they will recognise the fast food one quicker than other food logos. Therefore, that could actually lead children to influence their parents to buy the food. So if they recognise the logos more quickly, they might have more cravings of fast food. And the cues associated with drug use can cause similar neurochemical responses as actual drug use. So although obviously eating fast food isn't a drug, just seeing those cues can actually activate those dopamine receptors in your brain. They can give you that buzz even as much as taking that drug itself or eating the fast food itself. So again, if you want to pause it and then write that up onto page 19 and then press play when you're ready to go through the next question. Okay, and then finally, how do obese people respond to food cues? So people who are obese show stronger neural activation in response to food cues and need to make more of an effort to control their appetite when they see them. So obviously we've got cues all around us. There's adverts, there's TV adverts, there's things on social media. And if you are obese, researchers found that actually it's harder for you to not think about those cues and want to go out and buy, a Big Mac or unhealthy food, a Starbucks or something like that. Okay, so actually that's quite surprising, isn't it? So when someone has a food craving, someone who is overweight might have a heightened awareness of the food cues. So not only do they find it harder to suppress the food cues, they might actually have a heightened awareness of it. So they might be more aware and they might be seeing those cues more frequently. So again, if you want to write that up onto page 19 and then press play when you're ready to go through the next section. Okay, so bottom of page 19 now, we're looking at positive and negative reinforcement again, just a little bit more of a recap. So if you want to write this into your booklet, so positive reinforcement is followed by the addition of something pleasant, increasing your chance of carrying out the behaviour again. And negative reinforcement is when a behaviour is followed by the removal of something unpleasant, increasing your chance of carrying it out again. So an example of positive reinforcement would be getting a sticker for doing your homework. An example of negative reinforcement would be receiving a detention for not doing your homework. So therefore you do your homework to make sure you don't get that detention. Okay, so again, if you want to copy that up onto page 19, and then we'll go through the next section in a minute. Okay. So, we've got operant conditioning here. And this is learning through consequences. So, forming a link between a behaviour and its consequence. We've already kind of gone through this already. So, we've got reinforcement and punishment. So, reinforcement increases the chance of you carrying out the behaviour again. And you've got positive reinforcements. We've talked about this, haven't we? When a behaviour is followed by a pleasant stimulus. So if you eat chocolate, it makes you happy. And then you've got negative reinforcement, where a behaviour is followed by the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. Okay, so you do something to stop being nagged or to avoid stress. So if your parents are always nagging at you to do something, you would make sure you do it to avoid the stress. So positive reinforcement, something is added. Negative reinforcement, something is taken away. Okay, so with positive or negative reinforcement, I just want you to have a think about these examples. So on a piece of paper, if you want to write 1 to 8, and then write down whether you think that's an example of positive or negative reinforcement. So press pause and then press play when you're ready to go through the answers. So let's go through them. So number 1, making sure you do your homework to avoid getting a detention. That would be negative reinforcement because you're doing something to avoid something unpleasant. Number 2, doing your homework to get a gold star. That would obviously be positive reinforcement. Number 3, making sure you get home in time so that you don't get grounded. That would obviously be a negative reinforcement. Making sure you're on time for work so you don't get sacked, that would also be negative reinforcement. Working hard at work to get a bonus at Christmas would be positive reinforcement. Somebody paying you a compliment, positive reinforcement. Getting likes on social media, positive reinforcement. And then buying your brother a birthday present to avoid him being upset would be negative reinforcement. So tick off whether you got those right. If you didn't get them right, it might be worth going back and just recapping over operant conditioning and then having another go. So if you want to turn to page 20, we're just going to finish off the final bit of this section, and we're going to have a look at dopamine. Okay, so dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter. So it's a chemical which is released into your brain, and it basically is released when you eat food that you like, take drugs, or do something that you enjoy. Okay, so it contributes to feelings of pleasure and satisfaction, and it's a big neurotransmitter which plays a huge role in the reward system. So anything that you do that gives you a little bit of a buzz, that's dopamine being released. And it has a massive role to play in mood, motivation and attention, and can also affect learning and emotional responses. So thinking about positive, negative reinforcement and also dopamine, how do you think we could apply that to smoking? So again, just have a little think on your own, press pause and then press play when you're ready to go through it. So if you have a look at this diagram which you've got in your booklet, we'll just talk about the process of smoking. So you can see here you've got the numbers and they're going round in a anti-clockwise direction. Okay, so the first step is nicotine is delivered by smoking. The nicotine then travels to the brain, so that's number 2. Nicotine activates nicotinic receptors, which stimulate the release of dopamine, so that's number 3 in the brain. Dopamine is released, which leads to pleasant feelings of calm and reward. And then eventually the dopamine levels will reduce again, leading to withdrawal symptoms of stress and anxiety. So when somebody doesn't smoke, they will get withdrawal symptoms. So they might feel stressed or anxious or shaky, for example. and then because they feel withdrawal effects, they feel rubbish again, they continue to smoke. So the nicotinic receptors stimulate the release of dopamine. So do you want to fill that in on page 20 where you've got a gap for that space there? Dopamine produces feelings of calmness and pleasure. So that's the next two gaps. And then this feeling is rewarding and it positively reinforces the smoking behaviour. So copy that up into the first four gaps on the top of page 20. Okay, when you're ready to move on, if you want a bit more time, feel free to pause the video and then press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, next one. So negative reinforcement. So we're still on the top of page 20, we've just got a few more little gaps to fill in. So when a regular smoker doesn't have nicotine, withdrawal effects are quickly experienced. And some examples there: agitation, poor concentration, anxiety, and poor sleep. And therefore, smoking a cigarette will stop these symptoms, and therefore smoking another cigarette is negatively reinforcing. So people continue to smoke because they want to get rid of the negative, the withdrawal effects. So people smoke again to get rid of that stress and anxiety. Okay, so again, pause the video, make sure you filled in all of that on page 20, and then press play when you're ready to go through the next part. Okay, so there's a link in your booklet if you want to scan the QR code and have a read of that. Just spend 5 or 10 minutes doing a little bit of reading, and then we'll go through it together. It is quite a long article, so I've summarised it for you on the video. So another example here is taking prescription painkillers. So we're not just talking about paracetamol or ibuprofen, we're talking about actually taking strong painkillers which are prescribed by your doctor. So sometimes they're known as opioids. So they are part of the family, the same as sort of heroin and things like that. But that doesn't mean if you prescribe them, you're a heroin user. It just means that they are the same sort of family, and they are highly addictive. So you need to be really careful if you are taking them. So in this article, it suggests that someone who takes painkillers, so someone who might have been in a car accident, might be in a lot of pain. Okay, so therefore what they do is they might take these painkillers which have been prescribed by their doctor, and they make them feel better. So they get rid of the pain, but also they give them a bit of a buzz because it's acting on dopamine receptors as well. So that would be positive reinforcements. It's making them feel happy when they take the painkillers. But if somebody stops taking the drug, they might get withdrawal effects. Or if they don't take it for maybe a day or two, they may start to feel like they have withdrawal effects. And some of those withdrawal effects are things like shaking, low mood, anxiety, and excessive sweating. And therefore someone will need to continue to take the opioids, which will then remove the negative side effects, which are negative reinforcement. So remember that positive reinforcement is gaining something pleasant. So that would be them feeling happy when they take the painkillers, and the negative reinforcement would be removing the unpleasant side effects. So if you want to just write that up into page 20, press pause and then press play when you're ready. Okay, so the last little bit we've got to do for this section is incentivising behaviour. So if you get an incentive for something, it means motivating or encouraging you to do something. So that this might have happened in the past. Your parents may have said to you, if you clean your room, I'll give you £10 pocket money or whatever when you were younger. Okay, so we can use this so if you want to write down the definition of what incentivising behaviour actually means, and then you've got most of those examples in your booklet anyway. So you may have heard of a token economy. So an idea of a token economy is when you do something that's desirable. So if you clean your room or something like that, you would get a token, and then you can exchange your tokens for things you actually want. Okay, so in prisons they use this a lot, where they give people a token for keeping their room tidy or for doing good behaviour, and then they can exchange that for clothes out of a catalogue or toiletries or things like that. Okay, or even time. You know, you can have 10 minutes in the gym if you have 10 tokens, for example. So you can see here, this is based on a sort of child's example. So child has no access to tokens. Therefore, if they engage in desirable behaviours, they're then given a token and they can trade it in for certain things. So it's a little bit like when you're younger, you might have had a star chart, and then when you get 100 stars, you can then exchange that for something else that you actually want. So this has actually been used to treat cocaine addiction. And what happened here was patients were given shopping vouchers when they were tested negative for cocaine through urine samples. And what they found was that it did increase the number of patients who stopped taking cocaine for up to 12 weeks compared to a traditional 12-step programme. So thinking about that, do you think that would work in the long run, or do you think that actually people would only stop taking the cocaine for the time of the programme and then not actually a long-term change? That's something that you might want to think about. There was also another study that was done that was looking at stopping people from smoking during pregnancy. So again, if you want to scan the QR code, have a read of the programme, and then you can make some notes on it, and then we'll go through it together in a minute. So let's have a look. What happened with this study was there was gift vouchers worth £400, which were given to pregnant smokers, which made them more likely to quit. So 612 pregnant women were referred to a pregnancy stop smoking campaign. They were either put into a group with standard care alone, or they were given up to £400 in vouchers to stop. And the findings were, so significantly more women in the voucher group, so 22.5% stopped smoking by late pregnancy, which was 34 to 38 weeks, compared to the control group, who were 8.6%. So therefore, that shows that there was a much better uptake in the amount of people who stopped smoking compared to those who didn't receive any reward for that. So does that surprise you? And again, do you think this is going to last for a long time, or maybe not? Okay, last little bit then on page 22. So you may have seen that the government were looking at a 6-month pilot scheme. So this is trying to, again, give people rewards for exercising. And they've called it the Health Incentive Scheme. Now, obviously, this scheme was supposed to be launched in January, and hasn't been much about it, I don't think. So maybe it's been delayed slightly, but this was another way that the government were looking at incentivising behaviour, so giving people incentive to exercise. So again, just have a think, do you think this will work, and why or why not, and try and think about linking it to token economies. So a little bit of a recap just for the last bit of the session. So what is incentivising behaviour? What's a token economy and how are they used, and how could it be used to change behaviour? So just a little bit of a recap of the last part of the video. So if you want to press pause and then press play when you're ready. So for the first question, incentivising behaviour, it's providing somebody with a reward which should increase the likelihood of them engaging in a behaviour or stopping their addiction, for example. A token economy is where people are given tokens and then they're used to exchange it for things that they actually want. So they might be given a token for stopping smoking, for example, a token per day, and then they can swap it for something that they actually want. And it can be used to change behaviour because it can give people an incentive to want to stop smoking or drinking or whatever health behaviour that they are engaging in. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the session. Make sure all of your booklet is filled in and ready for the next video. Okay, thank you very much.